Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Joe Lambert of Joe Lambert Mastering. And if you're not familiar with him, Joe is a mastering engineer out of New York who has worked with artists such as Lindsey Stirling, the Black Crowes, Sharon Van Etten, The National, Deer Hunter, the B-52s, Animal Collective, and so many more. And in this episode today, we talk all things mastering. And Joe is just a complete open book when it comes to his process here. And because of that, I think you're going to get a ton of great information. We talk about everything from how he analyzes his songs to the process that he follows and the gear that he likes to use and what decisions he likes to make throughout the entire process, all the way from, what gear he's choosing to what levels he's ultimately making his master set to, so that not only do they sound competitive, but they match the artist's vision and that they do translate well across different platforms. And we get into the debate about, what is the industry standard these days when it comes to levels as far as mastering goes, because it seems like today it's kind of like the Wild West out there when it comes to levels. And you got Spotify telling you should have your levels at one thing, and then another platform telling you should do it at this level. And, it can get very overwhelming. So I was curious to get Joe's opinion on how he approaches loudness in his masters and what levels he ultimately would prefer to hear things at. So, like I said, this is a great episode if you're learning about mastering and you're not sure of what the process is and what's involved, or even if you don't really care about mastering things on your own, but you're just curious to know what kind of things is a mastering engineer going to do with my mixes. This is going to be a great episode for you. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Joe Lambert, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How's it going?
It's going very well. Thank you.
Amazing.
Good to see you.
Thank you. For people who might not be familiar with you and what you do, can you give us that background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into this?
Well, as you said, my name is Joe Lambert. I'm a mastering engineer in Portland Manor, New York. I've started my own company about 15 years ago called Joe Lambert Mastering. And I originally started it in Brooklyn, New York. And I've been working as a mastering engineer pretty much exclusively since the late 90s. I started off like most people in the recording, well, a lot of people anyway, in the recording engineering world. I'm a lifelong musician. I've played guitar my whole life. I made a living as a guitar player for a while. Still play and played in bands my whole life. And that's what I thought I was going to end up doing. And to make a long story short, I ended up going the engineer route. So I went to college, and then after college, after working a few jobs and touring as a guitarist, I went back to get a recording engineering degree from Full Sail. And that got me pointed in the right direction. And then I moved to the city, a couple of weeks after, and I've, basically been there up until 2 years ago when we moved up here about 45 minutes north. And I work on all kinds of music. I've had several Grammy nominations for classical records. I've had a couple electronica records that were nominated. I do a lot of indie rock, obviously being in the Brooklyn area in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was just a lot of indie rock, and still to this day, that's just a big chunk of what I do. But thankfully, I'm lucky that I get a really wide variety, which is very fun for me and keeps it interesting.
For sure.
Yeah, and that's what I do most days.
That's awesome. Yeah, as far as the variety, I mean, there's some people that just like to stick to one lane and be known for one thing. And then it seems like mastering engineers are definitely the most flexible group of engineers who just take on lots of different projects.
I think you have to be, maybe, like you said, maybe more so as a mastering engineer, because unlike before, we're all working with a lot of different clientele, where maybe in the past you had one or two record labels that supplied you all of your work. I know engineers who were a generation before me. They had one client. It was like, either Geffen Records or RCA Records, and they did all the dance records for that, or all the, that was their thing, and that's just what they did. Since the late 90s, the whole industry shifted, far more to independent artists, people putting out their own records. So instead of doing 125 records, from one artist or from one record label a year, I do one record from 125 different artists. So it's that has, I think, helped get myself a wider group of artists.
Of course. And I would think that it's probably more fun to have that diversity as well. And, it makes you a stronger engineer because you're hearing what's happening in lots of different genres of music. And I'm sure that there's skills that you can apply to different genres, once you're armed with that information, right?
I agree. I think so. But also, there are definitely people who do not like to do that. They're a metal engineer, and that's what they're comfortable with. That's the people they relate to, or they're a hip hop guy or a classical person, and they don't like to really veer off for whatever reason, and that's fine. If I have no problem with whatever you find that works for you. But for me, as I mentioned, I really love the fact that I could come in and do, especially nowadays where you're not just doing a full length record every day. So many people are doing singles and EPs, or I may come in and do a couple dance songs, then I'm doing a couple metal songs, and then I'm doing a couple, indie rock songs. And, that's all in a day. It's just, it really keeps me on my toes, because you can't just get into a specific groove. You have to really clear your mind, clear your palate. Yeah. Forget about whatever chain you think is the right chain for these hip hop tracks.
Absolutely. So you talked about earlier how you got into this as a musician, and that was your goal, but then things changed and you ultimately went to Full Sail. But what ultimately made you go the engineering route? What made you decide that that was the new path to follow instead of just continuing on with pursuing it as a musician?
Truthfully, all I ever wanted to do was be, a guitar player in a rock band. And when I was doing that, since I was a kid, I was 100% in, to a fault, where, I took it so serious at such an early age. But what happens in a band is you have to rely on other people. And artists are generally not reliable people by nature. So what had happened time and time over again was that we would get close, and then somebody quits and you got to start over. And the final straw for me was I had the last band that I was really working with. We had a demo together. Everyone in the band was known from these other bands. We had a record label offer us a deal. They offered to move us down to New York for X amount of time, pay for everything. Everything was taken. It was literally this was my dream come true. And I still remember the day, getting this call from the other guitar player in the band. And then I called the singer for the band to tell him, and he was quiet. And I was like, did you hear me? Did you hear what I said? This is it. This is it. And he's like, yeah, my girlfriend's pregnant. And I was like, okay, you could still do this. But basically he pulled out. And
you could argue that he didn't actually.
Yeah,
bad joke.
Yeah, thank you. I set you up. I left a nice pause there for you. And I was just blown away. Are you serious? And I got to a point in my, I'm in my early 20s thinking like my whole life depends on these people. And I just didn't like it. So I decided, well, I need to be in control of my life. I need to be in control of my quote unquote destiny. And I just thought that if I worked as an engineer, I'd be able to do that, to have a more solid, quote unquote, little did I know, I just would be a little bit more in control of my life. Yeah. So that's what I leaned into.
I can 100% relate to that exact story, and like had experienced that so many times with all the bands I was in. And yeah, that's ultimately ultimately what got me into the engineering side of things as well. Cause I was just like, I'm tired of starting bands and being super passionate only to have someone back out. And then you're just like, okay, well, I guess I'm starting over again. So, yeah. So was mastering always the thing for you at that point then? Or did you plan to be like mix? Okay.
I just figured I wanted to be like a producer engineer. I still wanted to be the guy to make all the decisions. Mm-hmm. And so I learned about what mastering was when I was at Full Sail. And I remember being in, we were in one of the big Neve rooms, and Mr. Jones puts up this mix that he did for Prince. And I'm like, everyone's like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. And, it sounded really good, but I was like, well, I don't even need to be a jerk. Like it doesn't sound like, it doesn't have that thing. It doesn't sound like when I put, Purple Rain on, like that sounds like it's like a magical experience. Like, well, it hasn't been mastered yet. And nobody at that point knew what the heck he was talking about. So he explained it, and I'm like, And so that planted a seed. And I also thought that this is a really interesting thing for someone with my personality, someone who wants to get that final project, wants to get everything perfect. Like when I sit and listen to a record and I get that feeling like I did when I was a kid, which I still get, like that's the experience I wanted to have every day. That was what put it in the back of my mind. But when I started off and moved to New York City, I was, doing, the whole thing. I started off as an intern, making coffee, and worked my way up. And then along the way, I realized how much I just couldn't stand engineering for other people. Unless I was, involved in the creative process. In the beginning, you're just sitting there and people just tell you what to do. It's like, I didn't get in the music industry to be told what to do. So I just found it really boring really fast. And I produced a few things. And then just different opportunities presented themselves. And one opportunity was a studio that I worked at was owned by a record label that was bought by RCA Records at the time. And they invested a bunch of money, and we were going to build a big studio. And my boss is like, you've been here the longest. You've worked your way up from the coffee boy. So I'm going to have two rooms. I'm going to have a mix room and a mastering room. You can have your choice of which you're going to head up. So I went home that night and I said, I got to make a choice. And I knew there was, there's not a right or wrong, but I just thought that the mastering choice was fit my personality, fit how I like to work, how I like to live my life. I didn't like waiting around for people, till 3 a.m. So I went in the next morning and I told them, I want to head up the mastering room. And, I haven't looked back. I just made that decision. Like, that's what I'm going to do.
Love that. Yeah. I mean, mastering is definitely one of those fields where, you're not dependent on the musicians being there. You're not dependent on them like performing their tracks properly. Like there's a nice comfort zone there with mastering where it's like people are just giving you what they got and then you make it sound better. So definitely like for certain personalities, that's definitely a really good fit. Otherwise there are the people that want to be really hands-on and all that, and mixing and engineering is definitely a great spot for that. And that's one of the nice things that I like about this podcast is that, like, interviewing different people, you kind of see the different personalities and how well they fit in different areas. So now you've been mastering for years. You've got your own space, working on tons of records. I'd love to dive into your process a little bit there and what that involves. So when you're starting a new project, let's say someone gives you a track, like, what's your mindset going into it? Like, what are some of the first steps you're taking typically with a new mastering project?
The first step is to just clear my head, get in here, and just listen to the song and try not to come up with any preconceived idea. Like what I mean by that is, when I was, years ago, I would know about a project I was going to do, say the next day. And I'd get all hyped up, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and it's going to sound like this. And it starts to influence how you work without ever hearing the material. And you can color your opinion. So I just want to clear my head and listen. Nothing's in the chain. I'm just listening to the mix. I'll take a couple notes of what I think I would like to hear more of, or if I notice right away, like, oh man, I can't hear the kick drum. And then I think, okay, why am I not hearing the kick drum? Am I not hearing it because there's so much other sub information, or is it because it's a trio and they just, the snare's just 6 dB louder in ratio, and I got to figure that out. So I'll make a couple notes. And then, then I basically, for the most part, I will take the file into my analog console. That's my default, unless I do have specific clients who, like, they want to stay digital, and that's fine. I'll just, I'll do the same thing, but I'll just work with my digital components. But yeah, I just start listening, and I do what I just said, and then I'll make sure that the level of the track is kind of in the ballpark of what I want, because that's going to affect how you perceive the low end and in the rest of it. So I'm thinking, okay, now that it's in the ballpark, yeah, I don't hear the kick, So I'll start, putting I'll put an EQ in and just try to mold that. And I just go, I think in macro terms, I think a low, mids, highs, get basically the song, in what I consider kind of like linear, like flat, where everything sounds, in my opinion, balanced properly, or at least close. So once I have it close in a macro sense, then I can start fine tuning things. Like, yeah, it's okay. Everything sounds right. The vocals in the pocket. I had to build the low end because there wasn't any, but now that's, coloring. It's coloring the snare. It's coloring the vocal. So maybe I got to split the difference there, or maybe I got to add some EQ to the snare and or vocal. And I just start going down the line until I'm happy, or the client's happy.
That makes sense. So it's typically, I mean, just at least from what you described there, EQ, volume, and then EQ are your kind of go-tos. Where does compression come into play for you in the mastering process, if at all?
I think I use compression a lot less than people would imagine. A lot of people who don't know a lot about mastering, or that's not what they do, they're always assuming, or often assuming, that there's a lot of compression involved. And especially in today's world, where people expect things so loud, and people just mix again, I'm generalizing, and everyone's different, but in general, I don't need to do a lot of compression. And what I mean by that is, you're not going to see if you looked at for example, my Manley Varimute, it's not like you're going to see 2 or 3 dB of compression. It's like maybe peaking at a dB, and that's kind of a lot in general. But to answer your question, I have to get the EQ close before I can really make accurate decisions with the compressor. for example, if the mix has way too much bottom end, and I'm just hearing like this is really murky because there's so much sub frequencies. I think you don't want to, you can't really put a compressor on it yet, because if you do, the threshold of that compressor is going to get hit by the low end. So it's going to start working, and it's not even going to touch the rest of the song. So unless you're an engineer who says, I'm going to use this compressor to compress, well, if I'm going to use a compressor to push that low end into order, I don't think that way generally. I'm going to use the EQ to get it close.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I have it close, then I'll use the compressor, because I want a compressor to work in concert with the whole song. There's a lot of times I hear the pumping in the low end on certain things, and then the vocal's out of control, or it doesn't really feel like it's part of the mix, you know?
Yeah, there's always that debate of, EQ before or after the compression. And I think the argument that you made there is a perfect reason for doing it after, or having compression after EQ. Because yeah, you're right.
On a mix, yeah, on a mix, 9 times out of 10, that's what I'm going to do. There are certain times where I might get exactly where I want, and I'm like, you know what, it just needs a little touch of compression now. But yeah, 90% of the time, I need to hear how the song is reacting dynamically, and work. It's got to kind of work before I put the compressor on.
Makes sense. Yeah. Are there any other tools in your chain that you typically like to incorporate, like any sort of like saturation effects or anything like that you like to, or harmonic enhancement that you like to add?
I'm not really, I had this amazing Buzz audio EQ, and it has some really cool saturation effects, but I'm very hesitant to add a lot of things that just color the mix, because generally I'm very respectful of the product that comes in. So most people just want what they gave me to be balanced right, so that it sounds the way they hear it in their head. Now, if someone's in the room with me and they say, we really want to muddy this up, it's too clean, it's too pretty, I might use the saturation on the Buzz. I might also use my Animat tape machine, which is an amazing box. It's all analog, but it does legitimate tape modeling. And it actually sounds like a tape machine, where most of the tape modeling plugins that I hear, they just sound like compressors. And it's really cool because I can fine tune it on every single song. How hard I hit it will affect how much it works, just like a typical tape deck. So I'm happy to do on any of that stuff, but I just want to know that the client comes first. So if they're leaning in that direction, or if I want to do something like that, I will tell them or ask them and say, here, I'm hearing this. Or I might give them 2 versions, and say, here it is with the saturation, here it is without, and let them choose, because I don't want to be too heavy-handed. I think a way I like to word it is, I always remind myself that it's not my record. When I make Joe Lambert and the Hipster record, I can do whatever I want. But someone's coming to me, my job is to make their record sound the way they want it to sound. So I'm not trying to put the Joe Lambert stamp on it per se. So I want to make what they gave me sound as good as I can. And then along with that, I'm communicating with them. And if I think something's going to work, I'll let them know. Or if they mention it to me, then I'm like, yeah, sure, let's try.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it sounds like you've got a pretty simple chain, but I think that simplicity is the thing that allows you to respect the mixes that come to you and, not mangle them up too much.
Yeah, there's, I have every tool known to man that you could think of in here, like everybody else has nowadays. But if you just, if you just listen to the song, again, there's times where you need a pocket wrench. And then there's a lot of times where I don't. I just need to do a few things to get it just right. And the difference between a few moves, even like today with me, I'll be shocked. I'll just be shocked how like 1 dB on my Sontec EQ like just changes the whole balance of a song. It just blows me away. So like I don't often have to do a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's true. And that's the thing about mastering that I've always found is that, it's often these tiny increments, like, half a dB, a dB. And a lot of people who aren't very experienced in this would be like, I can't even hear that. But like when you actually pay attention to it, or at least when you like bypass that EQ or whatever, you're like, holy shit, that made a really big difference. And, I think some of that has to do with like the curves that maybe some of this gear has. Like, like I was messing around recently with the new Maselec EQ plugin, and there's also the Sontec one as well, and it just blew me away at like how simple and how little you need to do with those plugins to like get them there. And if you got the analog gear, then you also get the other mojo that comes along with that too, right?
Well, especially the Sontec. I mean, that thing, it still like shocks me how magical a couple moves can sound, and it is something that a lot of this gear, you almost feel like you're supposed to use everything because you paid all this money for it. And I'll work with certain younger mastering engineers or someone who's assisting me. And, over the years, I've had several people and, I'll let them do their thing. And then they'll come in and they may ask my opinion and I'll look over their sheet. And I'm like, man, you've got 3 compressors, 3 equalizers. Like, you've got all this stuff and you're like, I don't recognize the song. It's like they think like a mix engineer. And that's the thing too, is it's a very different job. It's a very different way of listening to the song, which is why it makes it so difficult when it's your song, your mix. It's very difficult to disassociate and then be able to master it, with objectively.
Of course. Well, yeah, that is the big argument for getting a mastering engineer, right? Aside from having someone obviously who knows what they're doing in the mastering world, but like, when having that third party who can just listen to it with fresh ears and offer you that fresh perspective on your mix, I think that's crucial.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we talked about how, kind of EQ, volume and EQ tend to be your big things there. And then I'm assuming at the end, you probably just finish it off with some sort of limiter.
Yeah, there's generally a limiter at, that's the last thing in my chain. What I like to do is I kind of like to have the master either 100% or very close to it going into my Pure Mix workstation. And then once it's in the computer, obviously I can use plugins and all that, but I try to get it exactly as I want. And I'll often do analog moves live. That's one thing I like to do is I will think dynamically. A lot of mixes now are very, everything's right there.
Yeah.
So the chorus, the verse, the intro, everything's the same level. So I will sometimes just work the mix as I'm going. And I write my notes down and I hear like the verse is the same level as the chorus. Or sometimes, a band will, especially you got a big, loud rock band, big, huge chorus. As a mix engineer, the band they'll work all day on getting the chorus exactly they want. And it's got the rate, the compression, everything is set up for that. And it sounds amazing. And then the verse comes after it, and there's half the amount of elements. So your compressor releases, and instead of it working, it actually the verse now is too loud because the dynamics have really opened up. And so those are things I will watch as I go along and make sure that the verse sits a little, and then make sure that when the chorus comes in, it actually sounds bigger. The song blossoms, things like that.
Yeah, I love that.
And I try to do them as I go into I try to do them live like a mix engineer because it's just more fun.
Yeah, that's the old school analog automation, like just
Exactly.
you have your markers, and hey, if you're only doing like half a dB moves here and there, it's not a big thing to remember where to go, right?
Right.
Love that. So obviously, like the topic of when you talk about mastering, a lot of people immediately think about like volume and levels and stuff like that. And there's all the discussion about like LUFS and RMS and peak and all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, at the end of the day, like what kind of levels are you typically aiming for, and what kind of things are you paying attention to? What kind of meters are you paying attention to for that kind of thing?
Well, I have several different types of meters, and the biggest problem is that we don't have an industry standard. It's the Wild West as far as level goes. Yeah, they keep getting louder, and people ask about the volume lowers. I'm like, yo, man, we lost the war. Okay, it's over. It's like I can't believe how loud people want me to make certain things. So it's such a problem that basically I have to have a conversation with every client and be like, okay, or I'll listen, especially a new client. I'll say, here's where I kind of think you should be. This is kind of like, see, maybe it's not like -8 LUFS, but again, it's their record. If they tell me we want it, DEFCON 5, then that's what I'm going to do, because it's their song. I can talk till I'm blue in the face and say, "Wow, this is going to sound better." But they'll be, "Yeah, cool, Joe, just slam it because that's what we want." And I'm like, "Okay." So, yeah, there's the conversations. And sometimes I do different levels for different projects. Like the same band will want different things. It's just imagine if the radio station in Chicago, the rock radio station, had one level, and then if you wanted to play your song on a rock radio station in New York, that station played your song 6 dB lower. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? Or if HBO was 6 dB lower than Showtime. And one of my dear friends, Jeff Friedmiller, who I grew up with and played in the band since we were in 1980, he's one of the guys at Dolby who sets those standards. And I talk to him all the time like, yo, man, we need a standard. We need a standard for the audio world. And this is just one of the things that the music industry has really dropped the ball on.
Yeah.
Because unless there's, something in place that says, here's what we're going to here's where we're going to put it. There's always going to be someone who just wants it louder and wants it this. And it's just, we're at the level, pun intended now. It's just silly. Some of the things I hear are I can't even believe they get released this way.
Yeah. So when you have a service like Spotify or whatever who's saying, -14, that's what we want, like, but nobody's submitting it at -14. And so
that's a great point. When they came out with that, I think their intentions are good. But it's really confusing again, because they're only one streaming service. They may be the biggest, but they're still only one. And they're the only streaming service that I know of that defaults to that. So if you use Apple, it's going to play exactly as I sent it. If you go to Spotify, it's going to default to the -14, but you could turn that off. So imagine how it is for the artists who aren't on a record label. Even the record labels, when this happened, like, what should we do? So there was a time where people were like, "Oh, we got to, we want to master everything at -14." I'm like, okay. And then a couple of weeks later, they'd be like, "Yeah, it doesn't sound as loud." I'm like, "It's not as loud." That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
So, and again, they're not a label. They can change their mind Monday. They can say, you know what? Instead of -14, we're going to go to -12 or -18. So all the, as this started happening, and, I would have these conversations with labels and producers and engineers. At the end of the day, the producers all those people I just mentioned, they're like, we're going to have it sound the way we want. Because at the worst case scenario, it's going to sound that way. And it's going to sound right when it's played back, quote unquote, right. Yeah, it's crazy.
It's almost like the CD standard is the standard still. Like people still want
level
those,
wise.
Yeah, level wise. Like people still want.
I would say but we're about 2 dB, something maybe almost 3 dB louder than what CDs were in like the mid 90s.
Fair. So then, like, let's say you don't have an artist who cares about the level. Like, what are you personally kind of considering your sweet spot that you find works best for you, or for like translation across all these different platforms?
I think minus 11 LUFS is like perfect. It's nice and loud, nice and dynamic. That would be my personal preference for a standard. And that doesn't mean anything to anybody but me. So, I mean, I'm generally going to be around, closer to -9 on an average record, because that's just basically what quality records that I hear that come out. It's kind of where they are. And again, I will almost always have a conversation with someone before I start the project. And if anything, I will err on the side of not loud enough. Because if someone says, "Yeah, Joe, sounds amazing, just make it a dB louder," I can do that easily. But if they say, "We think you hit it a dB too hard," then I got to basically start over. And, so yeah, that's the biggest, comment I get. "Sounds amazing. Could you make it a dB louder?"
Well, I imagine too that just the mixes that you're getting, people are submitting those all at different levels, and maybe that's where we should have started with this conversation, as far as like, how should people be submitting their tracks for mastering? Should people be sending you tracks at a certain level? Do you care?
Well, if somebody asks me, what level should we bring it in at, I'll give them my opinion. I have a bunch of frequently asked questions on my website, at joelambertmastering.com. So you could go there and it'll give you a whole list of things to help you prep. But along with that, there's a lot of engineers who they mix loud or they mix quiet and they get the results they want. And I don't want to interfere with that. If they think that this is the way they're getting the best results and their client is happy, I'm not going to tell them, "Oh, you got to resubmit." Whatever makes their client happy, I can work with. It is nice when an artist or engineer supplies me with the reference that they have been supplying to the artist. And that's super helpful, because then I know what they've heard.
Fair.
So if the reference comes in and it's like, "Oh my gosh, crazy loud," then I know I got to make it crazy loud, because that's what they've been listening to. Or crazy, just, loud. If they send me a ref where it's not super loud, then I know, okay, I know where, if I want to push it a little, I can, but let's see where we end up. So yeah, it's a constant battle. It's something that we as a company, my manager, Diana Zinni, who's been with me for a decade, she knows, like, everyone we talk to, if it's a new client, like, that's just something we have to discuss. If it's an engineer that I work with regularly, yeah, I know where we're at. We've had these experiences just like you and your clients. Like, yeah, I know what they want.
Yeah, makes sense. As far as like your opinions on people adding like bus processing in their mixes, like I'm assuming that kind of just goes back to what you said there, where it's like whatever works for that artist. Is that your approach there?
Yeah, whatever gives them the sound they want. Was it Wednesday? I did a record, and the guy, he asked me that. Should I do that? Anytime someone doesn't know, my opinion is going to be try it. It's so easy now with workstations. It takes you 5 minutes to print one with a compressor and 5 minutes with one without. I say, send them both to me. We'll sit and listen to them in here, and we'll see which one sounds best. I'll give you my opinion. We'll see which one reacts best to the treatment. So those are easy things to do, just like vocal up. Just always send a vocal up and a vocal down. It just takes the engineer 5 minutes to 10 minutes. But if you don't do that, and then I get in here and it's Friday and they're like, we need this single, but the vocal's not loud enough. And I'm like, well, you didn't send me a vocal up. So, there's certain, it's not, you could save yourself that phone call is what I'm saying.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. It is really interesting. Like, it does seem like these days, as much as, people maybe try to implement some sort of standard for levels and, all that kind of stuff, like it doesn't exist. So I think that's why people are pushing their mixes or adding compression or whatever. Like, it's just like people are just trying to get it to sound closer to what they hear wherever. And I think that's why people are just pushing things all the time. And yeah, it is kind of just the Wild West to some degree in the digital space right now, where like you said, like Spotify can change their algorithm tomorrow and they can make things louder, they can make things quieter. So it's like, it's really hard to prepare for that. And like another thing that I constantly see popping up in like a lot of mastering forums too is like even just like output level. Like I remember back in the day, people would say like, just add a limiter at like minus 0.1 and that was all you needed. And like now people are saying like, no, you should have it like at -3 or something like that. What's your thoughts there?
I think you should be careful what you read.
Yeah.
I think there's no solid, always has to be, but as long as you're not clipping, you're okay.
Fair.
But it depends how the song was mixed. If you're mixing it really hot, or if it's a rock song, you could basically put them, -0.1, and it'll probably in most cases it's going to sound fine. If it's just a piano, a lot of dynamics, and the person wants it really loud, you may want to drop that down because it's an unforgiving instrument. You will hear the distortion, you will hear the clicks, and so quickly. Where on a 40-track song with cymbals and keyboards, you're not going to hear it. So yeah, you just got to pay attention. There's no real rule. Yeah, I generally start. I will start at like -3, and then go between -3 and -1 depending on the material.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely, certain instruments are going to be more prone to the artifacts of pushing something really loud. So yeah, it definitely makes sense there. What about like, what's your take on the idea of like true peak limiting and just regular limiters? Like what do you tend to use these days?
I'm using, I use the DMG Limitless, which I love. Sometimes I'll also have my, I have the old hardware L2, which I really loved. Sometimes I'll just put that at the end of the chain, right before my A to D, just so I make sure I'm not hitting the A to D too hard. I could just back it off a dB or so, and then I'll use the two together. There's not the thing with limiters is, you just got to be careful. Sometimes you can just hear it so much, and I just hate hearing it, and so it took me a long time. I like the, what's it, Fab
Filter?
Yeah. He makes a really nice one. The L2 just sounds amazing to me. Like I still, like if I don't hit it too hard, like I don't hear it at all. And, if you use like the L3 I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing is, I don't know what they did there, but they really got it right with the L2.
And even the L2 is like one of those ones where, like you said, like you have to hit it right, because if you hit it too hard, you're going to lose all your snares and stuff like that. Like that disappears.
Yeah, I mean, I never have it at more than a dB and a half.
Yeah.
So I'm just basically, it's there as a safety blanket.
Yeah, for sure.
For those piano notes.
Makes sense. As far as like maybe another question I should have asked earlier about how people should submit their tracks to you, do you care about things like sample rates and what rates people use?
I care, but there's, once it's recorded and mixed, that's what it is. So I can work with any of those, and there's no reason to take a 44-24 stereo mix and upsample it to 96K. You're not getting any benefit. And if anything, you might cause some damage. So I don't worry about it in the sense that most of the digital workstations we're using now and the sample rates are so good. They're 44-24. It sounds great. You don't have to get carried away with 192 and it's got to be this and it's got to be that. It'll sound. You can make a really great sounding record at any of those sampling rates, and nobody's ever walked into a record label with a record and then turned down because it was 44 instead of 48. So.
Yeah. I feel like the argument that everyone who uses higher sample rates makes is like, oh, it's better quality. It sounds better. But I'm kind of with you. Like, I think that like 44-24 sounds great. It's been a standard for a long time and it works.
I think 44-24 to me sounds the most analog. So I really like that. And 48 sounds great, but it's a little extended on the top. And certain people like that, and that's cool if they like that. 88 to 96K in a stereo mix. I mean, you're really splitting hairs. But I think it's great if you use it and you want to record that way. I think maybe the most important thing is what your computer can handle. Because if you're an engineer and you're in a session and you're trying to run an old computer at 96-24. And your plugins don't work and it's slowing you down, like that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
As opposed to just 44-24 and everything's running smooth and the musicians are happy. Like that's way more important.
Absolutely. I guess like one of the arguments these days would be that like so much of the audio industry has shifted to like incorporating video and stuff like that as well. And so, like all these artists are promoting themselves on video. And so video is typically 48. So maybe there's that argument there for like, depending on the medium that you're trying to go to. But I agree with you. I don't think that it doesn't really, it's not going to make or break your record. It's not like one sounds like shit and one sounds amazing. So yeah.
What I generally do is I record all my masters are at 96K 24-bit. This way I save them at a high resolution and I can output them any way you want.
Makes sense. Yeah. And I guess a good argument for that too, like saving it at the higher rates for you is that like you're storing them in their finished version at the highest quality, right. so like later on down the road, if 96K ever became a standard, then you would have had that already. And
right.
So that makes sense there. How long does it typically take you to master a track?
It takes me about 10 minutes to get it 90% there. And then it takes me about 20 minutes to half an hour to second guess myself and double check everything. And, especially if it's a single or the first song, the first song of a record that I work on takes longer simply because I'm trying a lot of different things. I'm wrapping my head around the sonic landscape of what I expect to be doing that day. And so I'm really locked in. And then I might do a couple more songs and I'm maybe, okay, I hear this, I'm going to go back to that first song and make an adjustment on this or that. And then if it is a full length and once I'm 3 or 4 songs in, just mentally, you kind of relax, you lock into the room, the day, and I can go a little faster. And it feels like, almost like I don't want to lose it. Like, oh yeah, that's the sound. There it is. But yeah, that's generally the length of time. But there are certain songs, if I do notice, like I've been listening to this song for 45 minutes and I'm just not happy or just not feeling it, I know I just got to leave the room. leave the room, get a glass of water, do something, go outside, and then I can walk back in the room in 10 minutes later and be like, oh yeah, that's almost inevitable that that's what happens. Like sometimes I just get too close to it, trying too hard, or I'm just in the wrong direction. And when I struggle with something, I know I just need to back off, go do something else for 10 minutes.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a good point that I think, like at the end of the day, when it comes to whether you're mixing or you're mastering, we're trying to make music that ultimately translates and that will work outside of our own studio spaces. And I feel like as a mastering engineer, because you're hearing so many different styles of music, there's a lot of starting points. And so it can be hard to like calibrate your ears to know like, okay, this is going to translate. This is like my target frequency balance that I'm going for, that kind of thing. So are there any tips that you have there as far as helping you with like mix translation and maybe tuning your ears for the day? Do you ever listen to any like reference tracks or anything like that to help you calibrate your ears?
There's a couple things I do. First off, as far as monitoring, like my level is set. I never turn it up or down during the day. It's always the same. So, and it's the same every day. So that helps me get used to not just how it sounds, but how it feels. Like I know how the low end sounds in here. I know how it should feel. That's a huge help because if you turn it up 6 dB, it's not just louder. Like the ratio of low end to mid range has now changed. So if you are changing the level of your output, it's so easy to get lost. And when I come in the morning, generally I get in here around 9 o'clock. I'll just put a couple songs on, or I'll put a record on that I did recently, or just something that I know. And I'm not even really critically listening. It's just kind of in the background while I'm looking at emails and stuff. But even that, it kind of like starts to subconsciously set my brain. And then I'll just sit in the sweet spot and just sit there and listen to a song or two. And just listen for 5-10 minutes. And that helps me relax, helps me focus. And then, the first song or two that I'm working on during the day, I'll get it where I think it sits well. And then I'll compare it to something else that I heard earlier in the day just to make sure I'm not off by a little. Because in my world, like if I'm off by a dB, that's a lot. Like I can't have a record that the whole record's a dB too much or less. Like it's got to be right on the nugget. So I will sweat the small stuff and just, and then I can just listen to a few things and I can lock in pretty good. And yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, then like, how do you ultimately know when you're done with mastering a track? Like at what point are you like nailed it? Like this is done, ship it, whatever.
I think it's just from all the experience and all the things we talked about. It just sounds to me like I go back to the reference or the flat mix and I listen and I'm like, yeah, I just sounds the way I think it should, for lack of a better way to put it. And going along with everything else that we talked about, I think this is right. And ultimately, right, wrong, it's just the client's going to let me know. Mm-hmm. So you can't really struggle too much because at the end of the day, your client's going to decide, like, you know what, it sounds great, but I like things to lean a little bright. I like things to lean a little loud. I like things to lean with the vocal. I like the vocal to be a little like weirdly loud, so that's when I know it's done, is when the client says, yeah, we're good.
Makes sense. So ultimately then at the end of the day for you, like how would you define what makes a great mastered mix?
A great mastered mix is just that when I sit and listen to it, or when anyone sits and listens to it, you're not thinking about anything but the song. You're just enjoying it. You can if you want to focus on the vocal, it's easy. If you want to focus on the kick, it's easy. If you want to focus on any specific element, it's all there for you without being fatigued. And it just has that feeling like, you get a sense of depth. I feel excited. Like, yeah, this sound, I don't know really how else to describe it. Like when I have that feeling where I'm excited, it's just like, oh my gosh, it just sounds so good,
Yep.
And I want to hear it again. I'm not, you got to want to turn it up. It's got to, there's those certain songs, that like, you don't really want to turn it up because it's a little strident, or it's something about it's just not perfect. And it's just not as, you're like, yeah, I love that song, but I didn't go and hit repeat. Like I wanted to feel like I want to listen to that song again.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, it's funny you talk about like wanting to turn it up, considering we were just talking about like monitoring at the same levels, but there's some truth to that, which is that like, when you're into a song, you want to crank it louder. And so you want to know that like, you want to have a master that sounds good, loud and quiet and as well.
It's got to translate, obviously. Like when it is balanced well, it just translates. You don't have to worry about it. It sounds good on my $20,000 speakers. It sounds good on my in-ears. Like I don't have to worry about it. Mm-hmm. It just sounds, it translates well. It's enjoyable on any of those platforms.
Makes sense. And I think it, maybe that's a perfect spot to wrap up, because it kind of ties back to what you were talking about earlier, and as far as like, listening to the records in school and, being excited about like the Prince stuff and like, it didn't sound as exciting, So
exactly.
Yeah. You've been on this quest this entire time to get it sounding exciting and get you feeling the songs a lot more. Yeah.
It's true. It's like, I still feel like a little kid when I'm listening and working. Like, the hair on my arm stands up. It's that's exciting to me. And I really, when I don't feel that way, I know something's not right. Fair.
Yeah, it's a good barometer. Sometimes, fuck luffs and all that stuff. It's just like the goosebump effect,
Exactly.
Right on. Well, Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It was great to learn more about your process, and I appreciate your very detailed answers. And, I think that for people who are learning about mastering and wanting to maybe pursue it themselves, I think you gave them a lot of great information. And I also think for people who are like, mastering isn't for me, but I know I need to hire someone, I think that from this interview, they're going to be able to understand what goes into it and ultimately how to choose a good mastering engineer who's going to help them get the sound that they're after. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even potentially work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You could go to my website at joelambertmastering.com. My email is joelambert@jlmsound.com. I'm happy to talk to people. If you just have questions you want to ask me, feel free to email me. There's all sorts of cool stuff on my website that'll help you if you have questions. I'm here. I'm ready to work.
Right on, man. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So that was my interview with Joe Lambert, and I really enjoyed that conversation. And I love how open Joe is about his process. And you can tell that he's very thorough about his workflow and the decisions that he makes throughout the process. And I love that he was able to articulate a lot of that stuff in this episode, because that's the kind of stuff that's super helpful to know, right? To like understand, what are they listening for? And, why would a mastering engineer use compression on one mix but not on another? That kind of stuff. I love that he broke down that process and, mentioned that there's basically so many different tools that you can and occasionally will use as a mastering engineer. But I think the mark of a great mastering engineer is having the strength to know when not to use something. Sometimes that minimalism is often the most important part of the process. And like he was talking about with like the Soundtech EQs, like half a dB or a dB move can make a world of a difference. And that's all you need. But for people who are just like amateurs at this stuff and don't understand the process and they don't have their ears well tuned, it's like you'd feel like you have to add more and more. But like I said, I think the mark of a great mastering engineer is really knowing how to dial it back, how to simplify your process, and just enhance a song, but without going too extreme and radically transforming it. And I can definitely tell from Joe's process that that is exactly his approach there. He doesn't want to mess with songs. He doesn't want it to come back to you sounding completely different. He just wants you to be moved by it when you get it. And so, yeah, I loved learning way more about his process and, yeah, exactly what he's using and his philosophies on stuff. So, Joe, if you're listening to this, thank you once again for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed this and really appreciate it. Learned a lot. Now, to the listeners, I hope that you enjoyed this episode too. I hope that you learned a lot from it. And if you'd like to hear more episodes like this, definitely make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're currently working on music of your own and you're not quite getting it to the standard that you want, yes, mastering is definitely going to help you in that process. But before you get to mastering, the very first thing you need to have is you need to have a well-recorded track, and then you need to edit it properly, and then you need to mix it properly. And if you do all of those three stages to the highest degree, then when you send something off for mastering, it's going to sound incredible. But if you're not sure what steps to be taking in order to get the highest quality results, then that is what I'd love to help you out with. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, I work one-on-one with my students throughout the entire process of helping them with their songs so that you can make your song sound just as good as your favorite artist. And in that program, not only do you get a ton of training walking you step by step through each of the processes, but you also get personalized feedback on your tracks. So you can send me your mixes and I'll make you a detailed video walking you through any little changes you should make or any considerations you should make. And then I'll send it back to you, you implement those changes, and we go back and forth on your tracks until they are sounding the absolute best that they can, and you're 100% thrilled with it. And then from there, we also include mastering as part of this program. So you're really getting a beginning to end solution with your songs and getting a ton of handholding and support and feedback throughout this entire process. So if you're someone who is struggling, you're second guessing your work, and you're not quite happy with the results you're getting, then definitely make sure to look into joining Amplitude. If you visit MasterYourMix.com/Amplitude, you'll find all the details about the program there. And on the webpage there, you can sign up for a free demo. I'd love to hop on a call with you to show you around the program and to learn more about you and your processes to see how I can help you. And if I truly can help you, then I'd love to invite you into the program. I only work with people who I believe I can help. So definitely, once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/Amplitude if you're interested in getting one-on-one help with your tracks. So with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.